since it's so difficult to talk about it, I'll write something for just the family. I'll do a memoir just for the family, so that my nieces and nephews could know about this part of our history, because I had at that time 37 nieces and nephews, and 7 had been born in camp and didn't know anything about it. So I tried to write. But I was crying all the time, and I really was in trouble. So I said to my husband, Jim, I'm having a tough time with this project. And he says, what project? I said, well, I'm trying to write this memoir about my family in camp. And he says, well, tell me about it. Because I had known Jim 20 years at that time. We'd been married 15, and I'd never mentioned camp to him. He knew of some camp in my background. He barely knew the word Manzanar, but it was this huge secret that it was so deeply buried, that I just couldn't talk about it. So I then began to tell him, and he was so shocked and so stunned. He says, you mean I've known you all these years, and you've been carrying that around with you? He says, my God, this is not something just for your family. He said, this is a story that every American should know about. He said, let me help you write it to get it down. Because that was very important. When you go through when you have a cathartic experience, it's very hard to do it yourself, because what you do is you become ingrained in the suffering of it, and you go over and over. I mean, I know, because I wrote a book with a Vietnam vet. And, it really takes a lot of guidance to get them to talk about, or, myself, about something that seemed very minimal to me, but was very powerful stuff that my husband knew, that was where there was going to be gold in the wound, so to speak. And that's why it took us a year. And boy, he was the cheapest shrink that, I could ever have. And that began the healing. But then it wasn't until the 80s that we discovered what it was about. It was post-traumatic stress syndrome. And that's what happened to most of the Japanese. It was too unbearable to recall it, because they were afraid of reliving the pain of that experience and breaking down or get too angry, That happened to me so many times when I would go out and give talks, and the Japanese person would come up and say, I didn't have that feeling at all. He says, I had a great time in camp. And then I just would look at that person, and I would ask them a question, well, what did your family do, or something, and touch upon something, and they would burst into tears right there, and shocking themselves, because they just hadn't allowed themselves to really feel. Because it is, it's very humiliating to acknowledge that you were a victim. It's humiliating. So, you don't want to say we allowed them to do this to us. So that's very hard to do. But once you are able to recognize that this happened, and that you're not a victim, because you can rise above it.